Hello, Megalithomaniacs. Welcome back. We're now just finishing off our lunch. Some of you joined us for our lunchtime session. That was fun. A bit of a community Megalithomania gathering online. We now have our next speaker lined up for you. And this is quite remarkable research, to be honest with you. I've read his brilliant book called Prehistory Decoded. And it goes into Göbekli Tepe and analyzes all the symbology there and reveals not only the Zodiac, like the astrological Zodiac, but also the fact that it goes much further back in time. And Martin is a scientist at the University of Edinburgh and a fellow of the Royal Society of Chemistry. He does a lot of statistical analysis in the motion of atoms and molecules to understand the properties of matter. And that's helped him solve one of the greatest puzzles on Earth, the meaning of ancient artworks stretching back over 40,000 years. So please give a warm online welcome to Martin Sweatman.
Hi, everyone. So today I'm going to give an update on my research into Göbekli Tepe. And my talk is in two parts. So first I'll talk about some new results for the interpretation of Göbekli Tepe. And if you're familiar with my research, you'll know that this involves interpreting the animal symbols at Göbekli Tepe in terms of our modern constellations. And the context of that interpretation is the Younger Dryas impact. And then in part two, I'll discuss how this is even possible. So that is, how is it possible that our modern constellations appear at Göbekli Tepe, which is probably over 12,000 years old. And especially I'll focus on problems with the conventional view of the origin of our constellations, including the zodiacal ones. Okay, so before I get into Göbekli Tepe, I just want to make it clear that evidence for the Younger Dryas impact event, which I suggested motivated the construction of Göbekli Tepe, that is now so overwhelming that it's effectively proven. So this was a massive cataclysmic impact event that probably caused the Younger Dryas mini ice age that lasted 1,300 years. And there's also strong evidence it was an extinction level event, killing off many species of megafauna, especially in the Americas. And the story that makes the most sense is that this cosmic impact was caused by our collision with fragments of a decaying comet from the Taurid meteor stream, which is the largest, most massive meteor stream in the near-Earth orbit. Now, the impact event had dramatic effects on most of the world's continents, and it also destroyed one of the world's first villages here, Abu Huraira, which is in the Fertile Crescent, just about 100 miles south of Göbekli Tepe. So this is known, and it's very clear. And all these other dots in this picture here are sites where evidence for this impact event has also been found. But we're going to focus on Abu Huraira and Göbekli Tepe from this part of the world in the Near East over here. So let's zoom in to the Fertile Crescent with Abu Huraira here, and Göbekli Tepe just to the north, about 100 miles further north. Now, archaeologists have been intensely interested in the Fertile Crescent for over a century, because this is where we find the earliest evidence of agriculture anywhere in the world. And so it was thought this is where we should find evidence for the origin of civilization, essentially, by which I mean the transition or the first time that it happened, the first transition from mobile hunter-gatherers to settled communities of thousands of people who depend on farming. And so to cut a long story short, what archaeologists found in 1995 was a huge surprise, because they discovered at the center of this region, close to the origin of agriculture, what they found was the world's oldest known megalithic structure, So that's Göbekli Tepe. And amazingly, it considerably predates agriculture. So this was a real surprise that has caused a lot of head scratching, because it suggests our desire to build structures like this that caused us to settle down, develop agriculture, and begin the civilizing process 12,000 years ago. So this is Göbekli Tepe. It's formed from lots of large stone pillars that are arranged in what are called enclosures. Now, a fascinating thing about this place is that the largest enclosures and the pillars so far uncovered are also the oldest ones. So the site becomes gradually less impressive as time goes by. Now, incredibly, Göbekli Tepe is built on top of quite a large hill. So this must have been a massive effort for the people of the time, working with their bare hands and basic stone tools in difficult conditions. But actually, what's most amazing about this place is the fact that its pillars are covered with animal symbols and other abstract symbols. And these symbols are not just random, they appear to contain information. So they appear to be an early form of proto-writing, 7,000 years before writing actually first appears. Now, clearly, if we're going to understand Göbekli Tepe and thereby properly understand the origin of civilization, we need to try and decode these symbols. So we need to be able to read what the people of Göbekli Tepe actually wrote on their pillars. And that is what this talk today is all about. Now, the archaeologists working at the site have effectively ignored the information in these symbols. They think these are just pictures of wild animals. And their theory for the purpose and function of Göbekli Tepe is that it is mainly just a place to meet and eat, a kind of beer hall, probably connected with cultic practices to do with ancestor worship and death, like a skull cult. Now, in my view, that's pretty lame. If you wanted to build a meeting place for feasting, you wouldn't build it on top of a hill far from a source of water. And there's no evidence for any cooking at Göbekli Tepe. There's no hearths, ovens, or anything of that nature, which makes its central purpose for feasting somewhat doubtful. But you would build Göbekli Tepe on top of a hill if you wanted to watch the stars. And this is the view across the Haran plain below from Göbekli Tepe, and you can see it's ideal for astronomy. Okay, so now here is a map of the 4 circular enclosures so far excavated at Göbekli Tepe. The oldest ones are also the biggest. So enclosures C and D are the oldest ones. And for decoding Göbekli Tepe's symbols, we are mainly interested in enclosure D, and especially pillars 18 and 43 and 33. And it turns out that we can decode the meaning of the Göbekli Tepe symbols with just these 3 pillars, like solving a crossword puzzle. Now, here is a subsurface radar scan of the whole site. So the 4 enclosures I just showed you are just down here in this corner in green. And as you can see, the whole place is huge. And there are clearly some more large structures waiting to be uncovered, and possibly they could be even older than the ones that have already been uncovered. Okay, so this is where we start our decoding of Göbekli Tepe's symbol. So this is pillar 18 here in the foreground. So it's one of the tall pair of central pillars from enclosure D, the oldest enclosure so far. Now this pillar is adorned with fox symbolism, but of most interest to us right now is this necklace motif, which is found just under the T-shaped head of the pillar. And it consists of what looks to be a pair of moon and sun symbols together with an H symbol above. Now it seems that both the H symbol and the sun have these holes or dimples in them, and more H symbols are found elsewhere on this pillar and on other pillars. It's one of the most common symbols at Göbekli Tepe. But this is the only example we currently have with a dimple in the middle. So we don't know what this dimple means, but clearly, whatever it means, it can also apply to this sun symbol. So presumably then, the H symbol is another, it represents another astronomical body, perhaps specific stars, or maybe the surface of the sky, whatever. It doesn't really matter what the H symbol means. The key point that we can take from this necklace is that the round disc symbol is probably the sun. So we now move to pillar 43, which is one of the most important ancient artifacts in the world. It's our Rosetta Stone. So this pillar is the key to decoding Göbekli Tepe. And the key thing to notice is that we have another circular disc symbol, which is probably the sun right here, but this time without a dimple. Well, if this is the sun, then probably these are not just animals. More likely they are constellations. And we do the same thing today, okay? So we use animals to represent constellations. Even more interesting, we have the scorpion here. Now we use the scorpion to represent the constellation Scorpius. So it's reasonable to ask, are these animal symbols representing the same constellations that we continue to use today? So in fact, if we take this scene as being at sunset, then down to the left of the scorpion, we would expect to find Lupus, the wolf or the mad dog, and that seems to be exactly what we find. And above the scorpion, we would expect to find Sagittarius with his bow, but instead we find an eagle or a vulture, although the wings and head of this bird seem to have exactly the right angle to represent Sagittarius's bow. So that looks like a good fit too. Well, if the eagle or vulture represents Sagittarius, then to the right over here, we should find Ophiuchus. And indeed, even though it's not quite in the right place, we do have this bird and fish symbol that looks a lot like Ophiuchus. And underneath the scorpion, we expect to find Libra, but instead we find a duck or goose. But that also fits if you view Libra as having a classic sort of duck shape. So everything seems to fit. But why would you draw a scene placing the sun in a specific location relative to the constellations? And why would you then have three more animal symbols at the top next to what look like handbag symbols? The most obvious reason, and the only reason I know of, is to write a date using precession of the equinoxes. You see, it's possible to write a date with an accuracy of just 1 year by placing the sun relative to the constellations on the summer solstice, for instance, if you know exactly how the constellation symbols relate to the stars that form them. But we don't know that in this case. Nevertheless, it's still possible to write on a date with an accuracy of around 250 years on average, if you simply list the 4 solstice and equinox constellations. So those are the constellations that the sun is in front of on the 4 solstices and equinoxes of a given year. So perhaps these are the 3 other solstices and equinox constellations. And perhaps these are not handbag symbols, but given the astronomical notation in use, perhaps these are sunset symbols, which would make perfect sense. So taking the position of the sun next to Sagittarius here, and assuming this represents the summer solstice, that gives an approximate date of 10,950 BC. And we would expect to find Pisces, Gemini, and Virgo as the other constellations on this top row. Actually, it's also possible that instead of Gemini, we could have Taurus, as the sun is in transition between Gemini and Taurus on the winter solstice, when the summer solstice sun is in this position. And when we compare with the animal symbols, we again see on this top row that they seem to fit the constellations pretty well. So this bending bird is an excellent fit to Pisces. And this down-crawling quadruped seems to be a good fit to Virgo. But the fit of Gemini or Taurus to this middle animal is not so clear. And it's not even clear what kind of animal this is. I mean, it could be perhaps a charging ibex facing left, or perhaps a crouching crocodile or lion facing right. Nevertheless, it seems that there is a strong, very strong correlation between the constellations that we expect to find and the animal symbols that actually appear on the pillar. Now, many of you might be very familiar with this paper, or my paper from 2007 with Demetrius Tsakritsis, where we developed a statistical method where we explain all of this about Pillar 43, and we developed a statistical method to try and analyze the situation. And this is further elaborated in my book, Prehistory Decoded. And without going into the details, because I don't have time here, we came up with a statistical result, which is that the probability that all of this is just chance is about 1 in 140 million. In other words, there is almost no chance that this is all happening by chance. Therefore, it's almost certainly correct. Actually, since then, there have been a few minor changes to our thinking. So I'd now say that the date range is probably centered on 10,800 BC with a narrower uncertainty, and the statistical result is slightly less secure. But these are small differences. Our conclusion remains unchanged, and which is that the date written on the pillar using precession of the equinoxes and the constellations we are familiar with today is very close to the Younger Dryas impact event. So in other words, if Göbekli Tepe's construction and therefore the origin of civilization are both related somehow to this catastrophic cosmic impact event. Now, of course, the site's archaeologists didn't like that. They responded with a rebuttal paper, but really there was nothing in their rebuttal of any great concern that caused a problem for our theory. In fact, they completely avoided talking about our statistical method, which forms the basis of our analysis of Pillar 43. So that means that their rebuttal was very weak. However, there are some problems with our work that we do need to address, and that's what I'm going to do today. Now, the first and most important issue is that our statistical analysis was based on a subjective ranking of the animal symbols at Göbekli Tepe against the expected constellations. In other words, we looked at the animal symbols at Göbekli Tepe and decided which one was the best fit, second best fit, third best fit, etc., when compared against the constellations we expect to see if our theory is correct. And as you can see, in our view, which is written in this table here, the animal symbols actually on the pillar were the best possible ones out of those available at Göbekli Tepe at matching to the expected constellations, which is why we've ranked them all 1 here, except for this one over here, which is ranked 2. And the number on the bottom here, 13, is just the number of animal symbols in total at Göbekli Tepe on the broad sides of the pillars so far uncovered. Okay, so we have this ranking table that form the basis of our statistical analysis, but these rankings are subjective. They are just our opinion of how well the animal symbols and the constellations matched or not. So this is not a scientific result. Nevertheless, our method is still useful because our theoretical framework, our statistical methodology is correct. So all you have to do, if you want to decide for yourself whether our theory is correct, all you have to do is to perform the same ranking exercise and come up with your own set of ranking numbers and therefore your own statistical result. In fact, it's even true to say that unless you do that for yourself, you can't in principle have an informed opinion as to whether our theory is correct or not. And what is telling, all of our critics on social media have steadfastly refused to do this. They will just not perform this ranking exercise themselves, which invalidates their opinion. And there have been no other papers in the academic literature that criticize our work. Nevertheless, this is a weakness of our theory. This subjectivity in the ranking table is not scientific. And so this year, with Demetrius Georgis at Edinburgh, I set out to make this an objective result. And that's what I'll talk about next. How can we make this ranking table objective scientifically valid. Okay, so I'm just going to summarize where we are so far. So first, we more or less know that the Younger Dryas impact event happened roughly 10,835 BC. Göbekli Tepe is implicated in the origin of civilization, and it's probably older than 9,500 BC. Pillar 43 at Göbekli Tepe very likely displays a date stamp for around 10,800 BC, which is bang on for the Younger Dryas impact event. So it could be a memorial to the event. But this interpretation of Pillar 43 is subjective because it depends on our ranking table, which is subjective. And we want to do something about that. And finally, the other main concern about our theory is how is it possible that our modern constellations appear at Göbekli Tepe? That goes significantly against the conventional story for the origin of our constellations. So I'll address this issue first, so how to make our ranking table objective. I'll discuss that next, and then after that, I'll talk about the problems with the conventional view of the origin of our constellations. So here's the problem. Let's look at this top row of animal symbols on 43, for example. And let's focus on the bending bird. So is it really a good match for Pisces? How can we know that? How can we make that case quantitatively so that it's not just my opinion? I'm pretty sure most of you can see that it is a good match. It's intuitively obvious. We have circuits built into our brain for this kind of image analysis problem. That's how we can read and recognize faces and so on. But how can we show scientifically this is a very good match? What we need is a measurement of their similarity, a number that we can use to rank all the potential constellations against this animal shape. All right, so here I have drawn a silhouette of this animal shape, this bending bird, and here we have the constellation we expect that it represents. So if we're going to rigorously compare these two shapes, we need to find a way to compare them on the same basis. Now, there are two ways to do this. Either we convert this animal shape to a set of points and lines, in other words, convert it to a constellation, and then find some mathematical way of comparing two constellations to see how similar they are. Or we do the reverse operation and fatten up the lines of this constellation and compare that to this animal shape. Well, after some thought, we decided to that the latter was the easier process. So our basic strategy then is to essentially increase the thickness of these lines and then make a pixel by pixel comparison of the resulting shape with this animal shape. Now, in order to do that, to get a good fit between this fattened up constellation and this animal shape, we have to be able to manipulate it to get the best possible overlap. So that means we have to be able to move this fattened up constellation in the X and Y directions. So that's up and down. We have to be able to rotate it. Now we have to be able to scale it, so we increase or decrease its size. And we also have to be able to choose the best amount of fattening until these shapes have the best possible overlap. And then we can count the number of pixels in our digital image that overlap, and that gives us a positive score. And then we can count the number of pixels where there's a mismatch, and that gives us a negative score. And then we can add up these scores to get the total, and that's the measurement we need. So we designed some computer code that does this automatically. It simultaneously adjusts all these parameters like the rotation angle, the scale, the fatness, and so on, until the best possible pixel overlap score is found for this pair of shapes. And that's our digital image analysis optimization algorithm. And let me repeat this process for all of the ancient Greek constellations in Stellarium, that's this software that I'm using, that were visible to the people of Göbekli Tepe at the time, and that actually set at a specific angle. Actually, there's another layer of complication that I need to describe. So these symbols are always animals in different poses. That means there's always a central torso with extremities like legs and wings and tails and heads and so on arranged around the torso. And it's the arrangement of legs and arms and so on around the torso that defines the animal's pose. Now we want to be able to match this pose with the constellations. So it's not just enough to look for the overlap, the pixel overlap. We want to be able to get the right poses too. So that means we have to label each line of our constellation as being either a torso or an extremity or non-torso. So going back to this top row as an example and using basic rules of anatomy for individual animals, it's obvious that for Virgo, we can take this central portion as the torso, and these are the extremities radiating out from it. And likewise for Gemini, it's clear that this connecting horizontal line has to be the torso, and these other lines must be the extremities. But what about Pisces? For Pisces, we have an issue. Which line is the torso and which is the extremity? Well, what we can do is use both possibilities. So for Pisces, we can define two constellation variants, one with the torso up here, and these are the legs, and the other with the torso here, and these are the legs. Now, there are a lot of constellations like Pisces where we have this issue, where we have to define several variants to cover all the basic anatomical possibilities. So when we compare each animal symbol with a constellation, we have to compare it with all the different constellation variants. And in total, that means 58 different variants for all the constellations we use. So you can see here the results for the bending bird. So in each image here, it's compared with a different optimized constellation variant. So we have 58 different scores that we need to rank in order from best to worst to see which is the best fit. And we need to do that whole process for each animal symbol on pillar 43. Okay, so that's our strategy, and here are the results. So this is our new ranking table based on this optimized digital image analysis method. So let's go through them. Well, the first thing to note is that the number on the bottom of these ratios now has changed. So 39 is the number of constellations we use to generate the full list of 58 constellation variants. And starting with the bending bird, you can see that Pisces is actually ranked second here. So there was another constellation which managed a slightly better fit than Pisces to the bending bird, according to our computer-based algorithm. Underneath that, we have the duck or goose at the bottom of pillar 43. Now, unfortunately, not enough of this animal symbol is showing on the pillar to be able to make a valid comparison. And in any case, Libra is not known to us as the scale. Sorry, Libra is known to us as the scale, not a duck or a goose. So there's no way we can evaluate this match using these methods. So we just have to leave that open. Then we have lupus, the dog-like shape here. Sorry, then we have lupus versus the dog animal shape here. And once again, not enough of this animal shape is showing to use our computational method. But in this case, we know lupus is a dog or a wolf. It was called mad dog by the Babylonians. And here we have what looks like a dog in exactly the right pose with paws and nose pointing to the right. Now, there's no other Greek constellation that does that. The only other canid constellation with this kind of pose among the Greek constellations is Canis Major, but that constellation was invisible to the people of Gobekli Tepe. It's too far south. It was over the horizons. They couldn't see it. And Canis Minor is just a single line. So lupus is a much better fit. So we think we're entitled to objectively rank this first. But I've colored that result red to make it clear it's not a result from our computational method. Next, we have the eagle vulture compared to Sagittarius, and it turns out that Sagittarius is the best fit to this eagle vulture. So that's ranked 1. Next, we have Ophiuchus versus the bird with fish. And it turns out that ranks third. So then we have over here, we have Virgo versus the down-crawling creature, and that turns out to be the second best fit. It's only beaten by Orion. And finally, we have this animal, whatever it is, versus Gemini. Now, that is not such a good fit. Gemini only ranks 8th, according to our computer-based method. However, Taurus, which is also a possibility for this animal shape, ranks third. So according to our computer method, this symbol is more likely to represent Taurus than Gemini, but either will do. Now, in the end, when we combine all these numbers together, our final result for the significance of the match between the animal symbols on pillar 43 and the constellations we think they represent is 1 in 87 million if the winter solstice constellation represents Taurus, and 1 in 4 million if it represents Gemini. Either way, this is still a very significant result. And remember, we haven't included the duck or goose in this analysis. So if you think that Libra is a good representation of a duck or a goose, as I do, then the significance of this result will increase even further. But even as it stands without Libra, we should still conclude that yes, pillar 43 is almost certainly representing a date using precession of the equinoxes and our familiar constellations. In other words, our gut instinct for these pattern matches described in our 2017 paper is almost certainly correct. So remember where we started. We thought this disk might represent the sun, because we can see the same disk-like symbol next to a crescent, moon-like symbol on pillar 18. So we have every reason for suspecting these are astronomical symbols, and we have just shown, using the scientific method, a rigorous hypothesis test, this is almost certainly true. But it's not just pillar 43 and pillar 18 that lead us to conclude that these are all astronomical symbols. There are other important pillars at Göbekli Tepe that tend to corroborate this. For example, pillar 33 here is another very important pillar. So this picture shows a replica of pillar 33 in the Şanlıurfa Museum near Göbekli Tepe. And it shows what look like rays emanating from the legs and body of this fox. Now, on the front face of this pillar, we can see that these rays are actually snakes, but nevertheless, they are emanating from the body and legs of this fox in a very unusual way. And on the other face of this pillar, the snakes instead are emanating from the body of the tall bending bird. Now, this makes very little sense if these are just pictures of animals. Remember, the site's archaeologists' view is that these are just pictures of animals. So this pillar by itself shows that that view is very likely mistaken. We now know these animal symbols are almost certainly constellations, and with that viewpoint, this pillar makes perfect sense. Clearly, the snakes represent meteors radiating from the constellations. And actually, pillar 43 is a very nice picture of a meteor stream. It's actually pretty obvious that that is what is shown. The way the snakes radiate from the bodies of these animals is just perfect. So now we can ask, well, which meteor stream is it representing? We've already decoded the tall bending bird as Pisces, and using our computer-based method, the best fit constellation to the fox is Aquarius, just as we thought in our earlier paper. We were spot on with that too. So now at the time of Göbekli Tepe, the Taurid meteor stream would have radiated from this position in the sky. So it would begin in Capricornus and then increase in intensity as it radiated over from the direction of Aquarius. And then after a few weeks, it would gradually fade away from the direction of Pisces. So this pillar looks like a very nice picture of the Taurid meteor stream. And remember, the Taurid meteor stream is the one blamed for the Younger Dryas impact event. So now we have a date on pillar 43, which is bang on for the Younger Dryas impact. And we have pillar 33, which is almost certainly a very nice picture of the Taurid meteor stream. So I think we can safely conclude that the motivation for Göbekli Tepe was the Younger Dryas impact event. We've solved Göbekli Tepe symbolism. And I've summarized all of that on this slide. But what about the other problem? How is it possible that our modern constellations appear 12,000 years earlier at Göbekli Tepe? The conventional story is that our constellations are from ancient Greece, only 2,000 years ago. So how can they be 10,000 years older than that? Probably this is the greatest barrier to acceptance of these conclusions. Many scholars automatically assume this can't be true. It's just impossible because they somehow know that our constellations are only a few thousand years old. But in my view, that's non-scientific nonsense. There is no way we can have much confidence in the standard history of our constellations. The true story of the origin of our constellations is clouded by the mists of time. It must be highly uncertain. And here's why I say that. So I'm now moving on to the part 2 of this talk. So I'm going to review the conventional story of the origin of our constellations. And I'm taking this view from the most highly cited paper in this topic, or papers, because there are 2 of them. So they were published or written by John Rogers from 1998. So these are classic references that historians often point to. Now I should first mention that Rogers emphasizes the conventional story. So he does also, but he also points to problems with it. Nevertheless, he's so overconfident in his ability to interpret the historical record that he then goes on to largely dismiss these problems and conclude confidently in favor of the conventional view. And I think that's a mistake. So let's go through it from the beginning, and I'll take you backwards in time through the various points of historical interest. So starting today, we know that our constellations are based on those of the ancient Greeks because they are word for word described in great detail by Ptolemy. So Ptolemy was a Roman era astronomer who lived in ancient Egypt around 150 AD. And this is an English language version of his Almagest, so the book that he wrote, where he describes the stars and the symbols for every Greek constellation in great detail. Certainly there's enough detail in his lists so that anyone reading his book would construct practically the same constellation. So here is his list for Pisces. And he goes through every star in his constellation, describing where it is in relation to the symbol of the 2 fish. And it's the same for all the other constellations. They can all be accurately constructed from his lists. And if you're in any doubt as to what these symbols actually look like, we also have the Farnese globe, probably from the same time as Ptolemy, that shows us what these constellation symbols look like. So there's no real problem in reconstructing the ancient Greek constellations from historical sources. Basically what I'm saying is that we have practically the same view of the constellations that the ancient Greeks had, because they're illustrated and written down in great detail. And I've checked Stellarium's constellations against these sources, and in every case I've looked at, they are excellent as far as I can tell. Now we also know, because he tells us, that Ptolemy got his constellations, so he was working at about 150 AD, so he got his constellations, all of his information, from Hipparchus, who lived about 300 years earlier. And it's thought by some, but it's not proven, that Hipparchus's constellations are also the source for the Farnese globe. Now, Hipparchus was a Greek astronomer, but unfortunately all the copies of his great works on the constellations and precession of the equinoxes are lost to us. But we do have his commentary or critique of a poem by Aratus. And Aratus lived about 100 years earlier. And Aratus's poem, The Phenomena, lists all the Greek constellations along with lots of astronomical data about the rising times of certain stars and so on. So there's a lot of useful details in Aratus's poem about the constellations. Now, we also know that Aratus's poem is essentially a poetic version of an astronomical text by the earlier Greek astronomer Eudoxus. Now, Eudoxus's texts no longer exist, but on the constellations, but we know that they must have existed because Hipparchus tells us this explicitly. So we can confidently trace the ancient Greek constellations all the way back to the mid-4th century BC and the Greek astronomer Eudoxus, who was, by the way, briefly a student of Plato's. However, that's about as far as we can go with any real confidence. After that, it all gets a bit hazy. We don't really know how Eudoxus came to learn about these constellations. What we do know is that a few of the non-zodiacal constellations, so Ursa Major, Bootes, and Orion, along with a few major stars, are mentioned in Homer's Odyssey. And these stories are very much likely older than when they were first written down. The stories themselves possibly date to the Trojan War, which was around 11 or 1200 BC. And we also know that Eudoxus spent a lot of time studying in Egypt, so he might have learned some constellations from there too. However, what's very clear is that some of the data in Aratus's poem, which is based on Eudoxus's written texts, things like the names of the constellations of the stars and the rise and setting times, are nearly identical to astronomical data in the Mul-Apin, which was a Babylonian astronomical text from the beginning of the first millennium. So because the Mul-Apin is much older than Eudoxus, it's generally thought that the Mul-Apin was the source of his data. But it's important to realize that the Mul-Apin only lists the zodiacal constellations and a few nearby constellations. So that's those near or on the ecliptic, which is the path of the sun in the sky. So it doesn't list the full set of Greek constellations. So according to the conventional story, the Zodiac and a few other constellations came from Babylon and the Mul-Apin, while the rest were put together by Eudoxus from various sources, maybe some the Greek navigators used, perhaps some that he learned while studying in Egypt. However, we don't really know if that story is true. It's just a suggestion. It's conjecture. But we do know that there is an even simpler astronomical text with fewer zodiacal constellations, stars, and data, and that existed before the Mul-Apin in Babylon, and it's called the Three Stars Each text. So the conventional story goes that the zodiac developed in Babylon, or thereabouts, in the mid-2nd millennium BC, starting with the 3 stars each list, and then developing into the more detailed Mul-Apin list. And then this information was somehow transferred to Greece in mid-1st millennium BC and combined with all the other constellations to make the complete set of constellations that we know today. But that's not quite everything. We also know that several zodiac-like symbols appear on major artworks in Mesopotamia and the surrounding regions from around 3500 BC onwards. So we repeatedly see on things like scroll seals and these curious handbags with their sort of sunset-like holes. We repeatedly see these animal symbols repeated, like the scorpion, the bull, and the feline. And they correspond to the expected zodiacal constellations for the solstices and equinoxes at that time. So the scorpion was the vernal equinox constellation Scorpius, the bull is the spring equinox constellation Taurus, and the feline is the summer solstice constellation Leo at that time. So in order to preserve their idea that the complete zodiac didn't appear until the 3 stars each catalogue over 2,000 years later, the conventional view is that these probably represent mythical creatures and not zodiacal constellations. And they then form the basis, along with a rich mythology, for the development of the zodiac 2,000 years later. But just in case they do represent constellations. Only those constellations were known at the time, and certainly none of the others that we are familiar with. So to summarize, the strict historical evidence which forms the basis of the conventional story, a few relevant zodiacal constellations might have been defined way back in the 4th millennium BC, but the complete zodiac wasn't defined until the mid-2nd millennium BC, and this information was combined by the Greeks in the mid-1st millennium BC with constellations from other sources to make the complete Greek constellation set that we know today. Well, that's quite a story, and it really is a view that is held by many mainstream scholars. I'm tempted to say most mainstream scholars, but I'm not sure of that. But is it right? How much confidence can we have in it? It's a really narrow reading of the historical evidence, which only considers the timeline for the appearance of written texts. But there are some major problems with this historical narrative. For instance, if we analyze the data contained in Aratus's poem, The Phenomena, we find that most likely it corresponds to observations made around 1100 BC. And it's the same for the Mulapin, because it has practically the same data for the zodiacal constellations. So it's thought that probably the full constellation set already existed by 1100 BC in Syria. But here's the problem. The Phenomenon poem describes data for both zodiacal and non-zodiacal constellations, and they all point to the same time period, around 1100 BC. And that suggests that most of the constellations are already defined by 1100 BC, in which case the conventional view must be wrong, right? Because the conventional view is that only the zodiacal constellations existed around that time, and they were brought together with the non-zodiacal ones much later, the middle of the 1st millennium BC. So it looks like the standard historical view is wrong simply because of the data in those texts is inconsistent with it. Well, maybe not. To rescue their conventional stories, some scholars suggest that Eudoxus had a globe, just like the Farnese globe, and that when he combined all the constellations into a complete set, so when he took the zodiacal constellations and combined them with the non-zodiacal ones, they suggest he back-calculated the astronomical data for the non-zodiacal constellations to make them consistent with the data for the zodiacal constellations. Really? Are you kidding? That sounds quite convoluted to me. But that is the conventional explanation. But is it true? We have no way of knowing. There's no evidence Eudoxus had a globe that he could use to do this. But there's another problem. There's a massive hole or void in the southern sky where there aren't any Greek constellations. And that suggests the constellation set was put together from observations somewhere in the northern hemisphere where the southern sky is invisible because it's below the horizon. Now, using software like Stellarium, it's straightforward to work out that this hole or void best fits a location at similar latitudes to Mesopotamia or Egypt at some point between 3000 and 1000 BC. Now, that's pretty vague, and it's just the most likely explanation or the best fit to when all the Greek constellations were comfortably above the horizon. Doesn't necessarily mean all the constellations were invented at once at that time and place. What it actually suggests is that the last time the most southerly constellations were adjusted to fill in the gaps in the sky near the horizon, the most likely time and place for that was as stated there. Nevertheless, it suggests once again that all of the constellation set, that the entire constellation set already existed by 1000 BC. And there's one final thing to say on this. I find it nonsensical, ludicrous, actually, to suggest that only a few of the zodiacal constellations existed by 3500 BC. It makes no sense to me to suggest that people from that time would have invented just a few constellations, Leo, Taurus, and Scorpius, the ones corresponding to the solstices and equinoxes at that time, without also inventing other constellations to fill the entire sky, or at least the zodiacal ones as a minimum. I think it's fanciful to suggest that because we only see evidence for a few constellation symbols, the ones that were relevant at the time, that only those constellations were known. Of course, the reason why many scholars are convinced the complete zodiac could not have existed that early is because they are wedded to the idea that the 3 stars each and the Mulapin texts show that the zodiac only developed much later, in the middle of the 2nd millennium BC. But of course, that's just an assumption based on a narrow interpretation of the surviving written text. It assumes that the constellations were invented at the same time as the texts appear, and that's quite a leap, in my view. So to my mind, given all the evidence we have, a much more likely story is that the complete set of constellations already existed much earlier, and that the 3 stars each and Mulapin lists are attempts to perhaps simplify the known constellations. Perhaps they were written down to make the known constellations easier to digest for ordinary folk, perhaps to make them more useful for telling the time at night, for instance. But whatever the reason was, it seems that some historians are reading far too much into an incomplete historical record that becomes more and more fragmented as we go back in time. In fact, we see the same kind of thing going on in Egypt at around this time. So in Egypt, simple utilitarian constellations known as the decans are written down at around the same time as the 3 stars each list in Babylon. So perhaps the Babylonian star lists have the same function as the decans in Egypt. They were perhaps simplifications of the known constellations that were more useful for ordinary folk, which is why they're written down at all. Now, if I had more time, I could show you clear evidence from prehistoric Egypt and Mesopotamia that more than just a few zodiacal constellations were actually known in prehistoric times, but I don't have time for that now. I'm running out of time, and I really don't need to do that, of course, because we've now got the evidence from Göbekli Tepe, which shows that many of our constellations were almost certainly known already by 10,000 BC. So just to summarize, there is no strong reason to believe the conventional story for the origin of our zodiac and constellations. It's just a story concocted by historians to fit the timeline of a few ancient texts. There's no way to know if the constellations were actually invented when these texts were written. In fact, the astronomical evidence in those texts is inconsistent with that view and generally points to a much older source. And of course, it seems that at least some of the zodiacal constellations already existed by 3500 BC, which to my mind means it's likely that a full set of constellations, certainly at least the zodiacal ones, probably existed by then already. Second, it's clear that the animal symbols at Göbekli Tepe represent a very similar set of constellations that existed by 10,000 BC already. And it's also clear that Göbekli Tepe is all about the Younger Dryas impact event, which therefore must have played some role in the origin of civilization. However, I don't want to give the impression that our constellations were invented at Göbekli Tepe. Actually, they're very much likely older than that. In fact, in other work with Alistair Coombs, we showed that European Paleolithic cave art, and we used a proper scientific test that compares radiocarbon dates with expected zodiacal dates to show this. So Paleolithic cave art almost certainly symbolizes similar constellations, perhaps going back as far as 40,000 years. So for details of that work, please see this published paper and my book, Prehistory Decoded. Thank you very much.
And Martin is here to take a few questions. So hi, Martin, how are you doing?
I am fine.
Fantastic, fantastic. So we've got a Q&A thing going on here. We've got a few people. So if you're ready to go, I mean, one thing I want to mention as well, I think someone's mentioned this in the question, is the fact how little of Göbekli Tepe has actually been uncovered. I mean, that's I mean, and Karahan Tepe currently being excavated, and so the revelations that might come from there are gonna like make you probably have to write another book, Martin. So we'll see how that goes, I guess.
Yeah, I look forward to that. I mean, I agree. Karahan Tepe is also a fantastic site. I've been there myself, and yeah, there's massive potential there.
Yeah,
we went there
we went there a few times, and it was just completely covered up, just with the tops of these pillars sticking out of the ground. But have you been there since it's been excavated, or partly excavated?
Partly excavated, yes. Yeah.
Okay, that's
So
fascinating.
we've seen quite a few things. Yeah.
Okay, great. Let's have a look at these questions then. So I think you may have answered this one in your final part of the lecture. This is from Nicholas Colostrom. And I think you did actually. The Pisces constellation was created in the 5th century BC. I think we discussed that, before which it did not exist. Earlier, there existed the Mul-Apin constellations that were purely lunar, not solar. There were roughly 17 of the Mul-Apin constellations crossing the ecliptic. These were used by the earlier ecliptic constellations like the Dove and the Princess, that then vanished when the 12-fold solar zodiac came into existence. So have you got any extra comments on that?
There's a lot of things there I haven't come across before, so could look into those. But as I said in my presentation, the true origins of the constellations has to be highly uncertain. The conventional view is essentially that they were invented when those texts were written, and in my view, that's a massive leap. There's no evidence to suggest that. There could be other reasons why they were written at that specific time, and there is pretty clear evidence that constellations similar to the ones that we know already existed from much earlier in Mesopotamia and in Egypt. And as I've already shown, Göbekli Tepe strongly supports that view.
Excellent. Thank you. And we've got a couple of short questions from Juliet G. One of them is the one I kind of asked you already about, the fact that more might be discovered. And she also makes this sort of global connection, which I know Graham Hancock's interested in, who you were part of your insights came from. Can we make a linkage, she asks, with the other sites such as Pumapunku because of the letter H, and Easter Island because of the sort of hands on the belly on some of the pillars, amongst other things? Do you think, basically, are there global kind of connections with what you're finding at Göbekli Tepe?
I think it's difficult to make a linkage. I don't see particularly strong evidence. I mean, an H symbol by itself, that could be invented independently. There's no reason to say that if they appear in different places that they have to be connected. Doesn't rule it out. They might be. There's always that possibility, but personally I would say it's quite slim at the moment. But let's see. There could be more evidence that comes to light.
Okay, great. And Matthew Smith, he asks, there are 8 symbols on the pillar and also elsewhere that Robert Schoch and another researcher have argued is a form of Proto-Hittite for the word God. And he also mentions that the hands on the belly and belts on the tail, the tall pillars, are images of the god Orion. How would this correlate with the Zodiac? Is Orion part of the system you're talking about?
So the first part there is the word God shown at Göbekli Tepe, potentially. I mean, I've read that paper co-authored by Robert Schoch. It's quite, I would say, a little bit speculative. Could be, the difference. I would emphasize that my work is based on is a scientific, or tries to be a scientific work, and that it's based on statistics to try and really create a very high level of confidence, and that's what I think distinguishes it from many other types of work. So Robert Schoch's work, is the word God there? I don't know. Maybe it's an idea to be investigated further. As for the hands and the connection to on the pillar and the connection to the Orion constellation, I don't actually remember anything about that. Would Orion potentially have existed at that time as a constellation? Yeah, that seems quite likely to me. Orion it's a very popular constellation. I think we can see it probably in many cultures. So it wouldn't surprise me if we find something representing Orion at Göbekli Tepe.
Okay, Andy Burnham from the Megalithic portal asks, why do you think your hypothesis has attracted so much flack from some quarters?
Well, I think one, and if it's correct, it overturns so much scholarship in all sorts of areas, from the origin of astronomy or origin of writing, basic, sort of archaeological ideas about how civilization developed, the connections between civilizations. That's one reason, I think. I don't know that it's attracted so much flack. I think it's attracted a little bit of flack from some quarters, and that can get magnified. I guess the other possibility that it has attracted some flack is that I present my conclusions in quite firm terms because I try to use a scientific method, which gives me confidence that, you know, I'm almost certainly correct. And I think that kind of degree of certainty in the results probably annoys some people, put it simply.
No problem. I think a lot of people get flack, so I won't worry about that one bit, to be honest with you. And we have a question from Stephanie. Do you know the German K. Helge-Wirth, or W-I-R-T-H, and the theory that he developed about the zodiac signs used LC maps? I'm not sure what that actually is correctly worded.
I don't know. I can't answer that one.
To do with coastlines, and sea maps, and it's basically Kai Helge-Wirth developed. Do you know about this at all? Is this obscure?
No,
Okay, let's not. Sorry, Stephanie, we can't really answer that one. Howard Crowhurst, who's with us tomorrow, he's got a brilliant new book out called The Megalithic Plan. He asks, and again, it got a very difficult to pronounce name here. Do you know about Chantal Wolowitsk's work suggesting the existence of the zodiac signs in the Lascaux caves?
Yes. So, I mean, I think, you know, there have been other authors who have suggested that constellations, the animal, pictures in many Paleolithic caves might represent constellations. And I think that the most well-known is Rappengluck, who has published a couple of papers on that. I would say his work is quite speculative. I think my work makes it a much more, again, it takes a scientific approach and makes that an almost certain case. Although I have to say that the difference between my work and the Rappengluck papers is that we have different zodiacs. So I would say that he was basically guessing. As for the I think the lady archaeologist you mentioned there, I thought her work was more to do with the orientation of cave entrances. And I think she shows there's a high correlation between the direction of the cave entrances and the sort of the position of the setting sun on a solstice or an equinox, for instance. So I think she finds it. A very good example is the Lascaux cave. So the Lascaux cave entrance to the Hall of Bulls does face pretty much directly at the setting sun on the summer solstice. And the sun on the summer solstice will shine directly into the Hall of Bulls. And according to my zodiac, or I'll say the ancient zodiac that we are proposing, the bull symbol is, prominently in that cave, represents Capricornus, which was the summer solstice constellation at the time. So that would fit very nicely with that idea.
Sally Deffern asks, the H symbol looks like two people facing each other holding hands. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it looks a tiny bit like that, but I think that a simpler explanation is that it is an H symbol with a dimple in the middle. I mean, there are lots of other H symbols. It's, Occam's razor, the simpler explanation is probably right, and so probably it's just an H symbol with a dimple.
Okay. We've got another question from Juliet G. I think it's follow on from the previous one, asking, can we reconsider your calculations when more pillars are going to be discovered, as your main research is based upon the one pillar at the site? I mean, we kind of talked about that earlier, but if you've got anything to add.
Yeah, so, I mean, potentially. I mean, the pillar 43 sort of stands by itself. I think once we get this work published on the computer algorithm fitting of the shapes of the constellations, I think that's pretty much there. But as you say, there's potential for other pillars to hopefully to reinforce that, to reinforce that connection. We already see several pillars at Göbekli Tepe that support the general idea of the animal symbols representing constellations. And I showed one example there of pillar 33. I think it's a really nice example. But yeah, but it'd be really helpful to have much more of the site excavated, to have more pillars and therefore more data to try and make this.
Absolutely. And we have Robert asked a question about, how it got filled up, because obviously these tepes, these mounds, I mean, it's quite well known, they kind of deliberately kind of almost like reconstructed and repaired the site, then filled them up. But is there any more information about that?
Not to my knowledge, no. I mean, it's the thing that those people at the time did was they lived somewhere. When that building came to the end of its life, they would sort of level it a bit and then build on top of it. So it might just be that that's just the custom of what you did to these places. I don't really, beyond that, I don't really know why they would cover it up. I mean, apart from to preserve it, it's just kind of burial, like you bury a person to preserve it for later.
Because I mean, just the amount of work that would have taken is quite remarkable. Much, even more so than building the site itself. And it was all carefully done. It was all like ancient. The most ancient parts of the site were already ancient when they were building the later parts of the site, and then covering it up after that. So that's a very strange part of the whole Göbekli Tepe kind of story. So the next question is from Michelle. Hi, Martin. Well, love your work on interpreting these symbols. Question: have you considered the artwork and symbols in some of Ireland's ancient sites? I've come across some very similar art there that appear to represent constellations or celestial activity rather than the mainstream narrative. And she has photos, apparently. So if you want to send Martin a message in the chat, you can.
Please, that sounds good.
But have you got any? Have you looked at that side of things and some of the artwork in the Boyne Valley area?
Ireland. I haven't really looked at Ireland at all particularly. So yeah, that's all interesting new stuff for me. I have looked at Pictish symbols, and there does seem again to be a very strong correlation between this ancient zodiac and the Pictish symbols. And there are other artworks, the Gundestrup cauldron, which is found in a Danish bog, but that dates to about the turn of, well, it dates to near 0 BC. And again, that's got similar symbols on it. So I think that the Celts, which were part of this Indo-European expansion across Eurasia, I suspect they sort of carried this zodiac and this astronomy with them. And so we might see it in all sorts of places, including India. I'm pretty sure we see it in India too.
Okay, super. We've got just a couple more questions, then we'll let you go. Ivy Merriott asked, did you try looking at constellations as mirror images rather than how star charts show constellations today? And they're making the point that we found that we found that they make better comparisons, for example, at the Bighorn Medicine Wheel in Wyoming, USA. Basically talking about mirror images, I guess, on the ground or within the stones.
That's certainly a possibility. Different cultures might have presented things in a different way. We don't seem to be, because of the correlations and the statistical strength of the correlation we've seen at Göbekli Tepe, it doesn't seem to be that, but that doesn't prevent other cultures from doing that.
Okay. And we've got our good friend Simon Banton. He's got a question. He's an archaeoastronomer himself, and he asks, does the Dendera Zodiac shed any light on this topic at all?
I think, to my knowledge, the Dendera Zodiac is a bit later. It's later than the Mulapin. So, to my knowledge, that's the conventional view. So, I think it represents essentially the Babylonian Zodiac at the time. So, I think it's like a confirmation of the existence of the Babylonian Zodiac. Yeah.
Okay. And final question from Frank Demos. And this goes back to the work of Graham Hancock and John Anthony West. And he asked, what is your perspective on their theory of the correlations of the Great Pyramids with Orion's belt, which is Robert Bouval actually, and the Great Sphinx being a marker or oriented to the age and sign of Leo, going back, 10,000, 12,000 years?
Okay, so this is something I mentioned in my book. I talk at great length on particularly on the Sphinx, not the pyramids particularly, in my book. So the pyramids, is there a correlation with the Orion's belt? Possibly. The correlation isn't very strong, so it's hard to say. I think Robert Bouval made a statistical estimate of the correlation. He came up with a very strong number, but I've looked at that and I'm pretty sure his calculation is incorrect. So the correlation is weak. Doesn't mean it's not a representation. It's just it's a maybe. As for the Sphinx, I quite like Robert Schoch's work on the erosion theory of the Sphinx and the enclosure, and I think there's something to that. And as for, and I think again, the direction that the Sphinx looks at, it looks due east at the horizon, so potentially sort of marking out the an equinox, position of the sun on the equinox on the horizon, and that would fit with its name. Does it represent Leo? This is something I say in my book. I don't. It might, but in the ancient zodiac, Leo was represented. Sorry, the feline represents Cancer, as far as we can tell at the moment. So rather than representing Leo, it potentially represents Cancer, if it represents anything at all, one of these zodiacal constellations. Now, Cancer, if it represents constellation Cancer, then it's pointing to a different time, and that time is just before the 8.2 kilo-year event, which is another very disruptive, would have been a very disruptive time, climate change and so on. So it's in my book, but basically, probably not Leo. I prefer Cancer.
Okay, and we've got a question come through in the chat from Terence Meaden, who's a brilliant archaeoastronomer and author. He's spoken previously at Megalithomania, and he asks or discusses, how certain are we about the age of Göbekli Tepe? Dimitrios S. Dendrinos suggests that Göbekli Tepe is younger than Bonkuklu Tala, which is supposedly reported as circa 9th to the 8th millennium BC. So do you have any take on that regarding about the age of Göbekli Tepe?
Yeah, so I've read those papers, and I think that, again, they're highly speculative. I don't see there being a problem with the radiocarbon dating of the site. Basically, what Dendrinos is saying is that the architectural style is better suited to a later age than the very early age that the radiocarbon dates are indicating. And I would say, well, it's using a modern principle about the development of architecture and applying it probably way beyond its realms of extrapolation to very ancient times. So it's really not relevant. So I would say probably there's nothing in there.
Okay. Well, I remember when I was at Göbekli Tepe, and myself and Andrew Collins were on a little trip there, and we got to talk to Klaus Schmidt about a year before he died. And he was utterly convinced that he believed it could be up to 14,000 years old, the oldest layers that may not have even been excavated yet. And then nothing was done about that. Nothing was developed. And then he died. Then other people took over the excavation, and little has been, all they've done is really turned it into kind of like a Stonehenge type, with visitor centers and buses and things like that. But that really intrigued me, that you got the top guy making claims it could be much, much older.
Yeah, I would. That's very interesting. I've not heard that, but that is very interesting. Particularly, you can see, according to the plan of Göbekli Tepe, that there are more central, potentially larger, what look like larger structures remaining to be excavated. Presumably, therefore, they are older. I can also just add that when I refer to the archaeologists at the site, I'm really meaning the more recent ones, headed by Dr. Lee Clare, and I think they've taken a backward step relative to Klaus Schmidt, who I think had more progressive ideas on the function of the site. So I'm really sort of debating, if you like, the current excavators.
Yeah, and
I think he was okay.
I think Lee Clare's is no longer working there now, is he? Either they've got someone else coming in.
Okay, I don't know.
Yeah, he was there for a couple of years. Yeah, and now he's gone. But yeah, Klaus Schmidt was a total legend, in my opinion. He was just really cool, really charismatic, kind of just got on with the job. It was amazing.
In his papers, Klaus Schmidt was quite willing to point out to similarities between the symbols at Göbekli Tepe and those in later cultures like Mesopotamia and Egypt. And I think he was probably right on those, because I made similar comparisons myself. So yeah, I think he had much more forward looking ideas than the later excavating team.
And I've got just a little message coming in the chat box from Simon Congreve. Richard Hinckley Allen holds that the constellations, or some of them, are at least 15,000 years old.
Sorry, we're 15,000 years old?
That's some of the constellations.
Oh, I see. Possibly. I mean, like I say, I've written a paper with Alistair Coombs, peer-reviewed in a journal, which analyzes or compares radiocarbon dates of the Paleolithic cave art in Europe with the expected sort of zodiacal dates of those symbols, and we find extremely strong correlation. In other words, we think that almost certainly those animal paintings are zodiacal symbols, and they go back even as far as 40,000 years. So the oldest one, in fact, would be the Lion Man of Holsteinstadel Cave, in Germany, 40,000 years old. Even in that case, the lion symbol fits with the ancient zodiac.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, I think all the questions. Oh, one's just come in here. Francisco J. Peliez, does your theory explain why Göbekli Tepe was protected by covering it with sand and the modern earth? Were they doing it to kind of prevent it being hurt by another cataclysm? That's a theory that's been going around, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I can't really add to that kind of story other than what I said before. Maybe they wanted to protect the information on the site for future generations, or perhaps it was just part of their custom of burying places where they've occupied and then building on top. It's just what they did.
Okay, well, brilliant. Well, thanks so much, Martin. We really appreciate your time. Do recommend you get Martin's excellent book. I've read it myself, and that's kind of why we had to get you at our conference. Obviously, we tried to get it to come last year, but it got delayed. So thanks for taking the time, and we'll see you tomorrow again on the speakers panel. So if you've got the attendees have got any more questions for Martin, save them up for that. And so you might get some questions coming in the chat box as well, some more specific ones, Martin. So look out for those. And so we're going to sign out for a few minutes, and then we're going to welcome Gail Higginbottom